Chair, Deborah Johnson, General Manager and CEO, and we have this evening an update as relates to the progress we've made with the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study. We have Patrick Stanley here who will give the presentation. He serves as the project manager for this endeavor, and he is joined by Joycena Vishwakarma, who serves as Assistant General Manager of Capital Programs. So with that introduction, I will the floor to Mr. Stanley to commence with this update on where we are with this much anticipated study.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm not too loud, am I? All right.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Thank you, General Manager, CEO Johnson, Mr. Chair, directors, good evening. As Ms. Johnson said, my name is Patrick Stanley. I am the Manager of Engineering Programs with RTD, and I also serve as the Peak Service Feasibility Study Project Manager for the Northwest Rail. So today, sorry, got to aim the clicker. I apologize to Director Sloan and Deshelle. I'm going to be aiming at you all night here as I try to change the slides. So quick overview, what we're going to talk about today is that we'll give you a general update on the project status. We'll talk a little bit in more depth than what we previously talked about on the required infrastructure. Some of those, a little bit more information on some of that. We'll also go over the common set of facts that we've been developing as part of this study, which is the ultimate goal on the study is to understand what those facts are. We'll talk briefly about some of the opportunities on the project, and in particular, that's the Front Range Passenger Rail District. And then we also want to go over the community and stakeholder engagement efforts that we've been going through since the last board update. Okay, so real quick on project status. Right now, HDR, which is our design consultant for the study working for RTD, they were currently really towards the tail end of milestone 3, which is really determining the base configuration. So this is really defining the core elements of what is needed to operate peak service on the corridor. And they have initiated milestone 4, which is the options, service options and partnerships, and also starting in on the option strategies and next steps. Right now, currently, we have contracted with the BNSF Railway to do 30% design plans, cost estimates for capital costs and for operational costs. They have provided us a 20% design plan set, which we have provided comments on. We are awaiting the 20% cost estimates from the BNSF currently, and they are working towards the 30% design as we speak. Also of note is the Front Range Passenger Rail District, which is actually being led by the consultant HNTB for CDOT. And they're working on the service development plan, which is ongoing, a concurrent study that they are undertaking as part of the Front Range Passenger Rail District efforts. And then wanted to touch on the RTD and Front Range Passenger Rail District. We are currently identifying with the information that we have at hand, as we move through the study, any opportunities and efficiencies that may be there between RTD and Front Range Passenger Rail District. So touching on required infrastructure, we have 6 new stations. These stations will be just like essentially the same as what you would see on, say, the A line. They're 400-foot-long platforms, high-level boarding, and that's an important piece that we want to touch on here in the next few slides. But essentially, it'll be very similar to what you've seen on the commuter rail stations that we currently have now. So canopies, a similar set of amenities that are equitable between each jurisdiction. What we have is we actually have a RTD commuter rail design template that we provided for. We're not necessarily going to design those fully out at this stage. It's pretty conceptual. But the agreement we'll have with the communities is that's going to be what a menu of sorts that they can pick from. We have 3 passenger or 3 freight sidings. These freight sidings essentially allow the railroad to pull over and get off of the tracks during peak period windows. So we have a morning peak window and we have an evening peak window. And essentially this allows them to, like I said, kind of move off the side of the road, so to speak, so that we can have operational priority during that peak period window so that we're not going to be behind a slow-moving freight train or anything like that. We have a total of about 7.2 miles of siding track that's needed in order to satisfy the BNSF requirements for us to operate on their corridor. We've worked pretty closely with the BNSF and the jurisdictions to make sure that we avoid traffic impacts, roadway blockages, that sort of thing for these locations of these sidings. Additionally, we have track improvements on the corridor in general. A lot of these are like curve adjustments on the track so that we can increase travel speed. We want to make sure that our service, if it were to come about, provides a competitive speed in order to get from between DUS and Longmont. So continued on required infrastructure, there will be numerous drainage upgrades along the corridor. A lot of these, BNSF has been here for a very long time. A lot of the drainage infrastructure that they have on the track is substandard at this point. And we are going to be modifying the trackway in many places. So there are going to be upgrades to the drainage ways. And this will all be supported by a drainage report that's being done by the BNSF. Right now, there are 41 at-grade crossings on the extended corridor, and that's basically the section between the existing Westminster Station and Longmont. 22 of which have already been established as a quiet zone by the local communities, 8 of which are currently being established. And then anywhere that we modify a grade crossing, we will also have to look at what kind of safety improvements might need to happen at those particular crossings. This might be a combination of gates, perhaps medians, pedestrian facilities, channelization, fence, gates at crossings, kind of like what you see on the A line and the G line corridors. We're looking at a rail maintenance facility to maintain the fleet in Longmont. And we've also identified a midday layover facility location at Westminster. So we have to do something with our trains during the day. Since we have 3 in the morning, 3 in the evening, we've got a pretty long time gap where we have to store trains. So I wanted to touch on the accessibility compliance piece. So we are looking at high-level boarding platforms. That's what we're recommending for the Northwest Peak Service Study. This is the most equitable and really operationally efficient arrangement that we can have on the corridor. And not just equitable from folks that have mobility concerns, but also equitable between the various stations and the communities that they serve. The requirements, we're looking at level boarding. This provides equal service to all Northwest Corridor stations and existing high platform B-line stations. So it's important to note that we actually have 4 existing stations on the Northwest Rail, which are designed right now as high platforms, those being DUS, 41st and Fox, Pecos Station, and the existing Westminster Station. So the operating conditions associated with that, low-level platform at Denver Union Station. There is a low-level platform at Denver Union Station. Those are tracks 4 and 5, but those are currently used by Amtrak. So if we were to try to utilize those tracks as well, that could conflict with Amtrak operations, and it could also conflict potentially with Front Range Passenger Rail if they were to come about in the future as well. And then really we want to make sure that the B line currently right now can utilize the same track and platform at DUS as what the Northwest Rail would, since we're really looking at replacing those service runs from the B line. So this slide talks a little bit about high-level trains and why we would recommend a high-level train. So high-level platforms, you end up with a high-level train. So it's important to know that low-floor trains can never serve high platforms because essentially you'd open the door and then there'd be kind of a wall in front of you. Many high blocks are really not acceptable to the Federal Transit Administration anymore. And in fact, Department of Transportation, which oversees the Federal Railroad Administration and the Federal Transit Administration have essentially come out and said that, it has to be operationally infeasible before you do a level boarding scenario. So this is the highest level of compliance that we can. And I should also note that cost is not sufficient reasoning for non-compliance of level boarding. Disadvantages of cars serving multiple platform heights. We went through this quite a bit, trying to look at potential options of vehicles. But essentially, if you try to mix and match platform heights and vehicles, you end up with scenarios where you're looking at operable lifts, platform gap fillers, bridge plates, etc. Each one of these have higher design, installation, and maintenance costs. There's also more potential for failure in those systems as well. We believe it's an inferior system. Again, it requires more effort, requires a lot more maintenance, and there potentially impacts if things don't work properly on the service, which affects our customers. Added overall dwell times. You can imagine if we have to deploy lifts or bridge plates, those require operators. They also require time to deploy. And again, they're maintenance issues. And there's a potential that you could trap patrons potentially. So if you can board at one of the level platforms right now, you can get on at any door, but you may not be able to get off at any door. And that would have to be well communicated for all of our customers if we were to try to do an intermixed high-level, low platform scenario. So real quick on the peak service feasibility study analysis, these are the things that we're considering and looking at as we move through the study. Initial level of service. This is basically what is peak service. It's the 3 trips in the morning from Longmont to Denver on the weekdays, and it's the 3 trips back in the evening from Denver to Longmont. So wanted to really kind of dig into that and look at what does that mean? What does that do for us as far as the requirements, and what do we need to think about and accommodate? So the operational requirements, what does that take to run those trains? Where do we store trains? How do we maintain those vehicles? Again, what is the platform configuration, siding tracks, those type of pieces that we need to take a look at. Obviously, we need to understand what the required infrastructure is. What do we need to build out? What is the BNSF going to require for us in order to operate on their tracks? And how much does it cost? How much does it cost to build those infrastructure pieces? How much does it cost to operate the system as a whole? We wanted to take a look at travel time. What do we think our projected time is for running between Longmont and DUS and vice versa, as well as the projected ridership. How many people do we think we can project to ride it based on the current DRCOG models? And then what are the benefits and impacts? And I want to mention just one quick, I know there's a lot of conversation about front range passenger rail and RTD right now, but so I do want to kind of reiterate here that our peak service feasibility study really is focused on RTD. We need to understand what it would take for RTD to operate the Northwest Rail peak service. Now that being said, we're taking every opportunity we possibly can to coordinate with Front Range Passenger Rail District to look for some commonalities, look for win-win scenarios, and make sure that we are not designing in a way that precludes a potential partnership in the future. So looking at the common set of facts, one of the key pieces that we touched on already is the station accessibility compliance. What does that station configuration look like? And how much does that cost? What are the siding track implications and the high-level station implications? Track improvements and sidings, again, this goes to the BNSF infrastructure. What do we need to build out as far as the BNSF is concerned in order for them to allow us to operate peak service in our operational windows? Acquisition of the easement from the BNSF. So basically, when we operate in the BNSF, there's really kind of a real property component to the BNSF as well as track usage that we need to come in an agreement with the BNSF on what those costs are in order for us to function on their alignment. It is a private property, so there's a kind of a cost to us for us to use that. Operational costs, operating and maintaining trains and stations. So that's why we're looking at maintenance facilities and what it would take to provide the maintenance of those vehicles and the stations themselves. And then, of course, there's the train operations and maintenance components of the track. So right now, we don't know necessarily who the operator might be. It could be RTD. It could be BNSF. It could potentially be an approved third party. The dispatch is going to be by BNSF for their section of controlled track. The one thing that's unique to this particular corridor is we actually have another operator already on board, Denver Transit Operators. So there is a segment of track where they dispatch. And that's a similar scenario for the track maintenance as well. BNSF, we believe is most likely in our agreement going to be responsible for the maintenance away for the BNSF portion of the track, but the maintenance away for the segment that RTD owns, which is operated by DTO, would be by DTO. And then, of course, ridership projections as well. So some of the impacts and benefits, continuing on the common set of facts, environmental impacts, NEPA assessment factors. So I would like to reiterate, we are not in NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. But the information that we're getting out of our study is going to be linkage type documents. So we're going to be able to use those documents to bridge into a NEPA process if this were to move forward to the next phase. Environmental justice and equity. We are doing some preliminary equity Title VI analysis for the maintenance facility locations, as well as service changes potentially. But again, like to reiterate that those are preliminary because you can't actually finalize those documents until you are ready to do an actual service change and actually ready to acquire property. Land use impacts and transit-oriented development. Working with our stakeholders, we want to make sure that our stations are respectful of where they're going to be. We work with our stakeholders to make sure that they fit into the community properly, and that the community, we're trying to encourage them as best as possible to make sure that they consider land use planning in everything that they're doing around our stations as well to help support transit. I talked a little bit earlier, avoiding actions that preclude front-range passenger rail requirements. Public stakeholder and identification of issues. We have done multiple outreach efforts with the community to try to understand what they're looking for and how peak service might serve their needs and what concerns they might have over peak service. And then touching on service characteristics, again, we talked about, what is the travel time? It needs to be competitive. And then required infrastructure, station parking and access, again, understanding what those components are and what the costs associated with those components is. So here's I want to touch a little bit on opportunities. This really touches a lot on the front range passenger rail and RTD conversations that are swirling around us. It seems like kind of all around us right now. Again, I want to say that we are working on our project, which is focused on Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility. And they are working on their service development plan, which is really focused on front range passenger rail. So, but with that being said, realizing that we have two slightly different focuses between the two studies, there are some economies that we believe are possible. And while there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out on each one of these things, these are kind of high level at this point, but we do think these might be opportunities that we can both tap into in order to make a potential partnership work if that's the direction that this goes. So probable joint operational efficiencies. You can imagine we could have the same operator, things of that nature. Potential synergies arising from common fleet type. We could be more strategic. We could be more efficient, and hopefully less expensive if we were to go in together to buy common fleet elements. As an example, we could be more competitive. Right now, we're looking at a pretty small fleet that would be needed to operate peak service, and frankly, we're not going to be super competitive given the fact that we're not buying a lot of train sets. Possible to share and reduce operations and maintenance costs. So we could potentially even, as an example, share a maintenance facility, maintenance personnel, maintenance equipment, as well as split the cost to run rail potentially on the BNSF corridor. Potential to share track improvement costs. So all the curve smoothing that we talked about earlier, which is to increase speed on the curves, just the track improvements in general to make sure that it is in sufficient condition to run passenger rail. If we have to do it and Front Range Passenger Rail would have to do it, those are costs that we think we could potentially come up with some cost-sharing solutions. And then potential to share cost of safety systems and crossing upgrades. And the one that probably most of you have heard about is positive train control. Positive train control is a safety system that we have currently on the A, B, and G lines as well. If we run passenger rail on the BNSF tracks, it's going to be required that we have PTC. So if you run one train, you got to have it. If you run 6 trains, you got to have it. You run 66 trains, you got to have it. So that's a good opportunity as an example. So I wanted to touch real quickly on the community stakeholder engagement that we've been doing. 2023 activities, so what we did last year, we had 2 corridor-wide open house events. One was in January and February in Boulder and Westminster. And then we had another major open house in November of last year as well in Longmont and Broomfield. In addition to that, we've had multiple local pop-up events. We've had about 14 community-based events where we set up a tent and just, people stopped by. We had conversations with them. We had about 900 or so visitors at those pop-up events, a little less than that. And then we have monthly study advisory team meetings. Our study advisory team is made up of stakeholders, jurisdiction representatives, and community advocacy groups throughout the Northwest area. So we update them monthly, get feedback from them on where the study is going. One-on-one concept design meetings. So this is really primarily around stations, meeting with the communities to kind of plan out and design where the station locations are going to be, how they fit within their surroundings and the planned community areas. And then we had a board committee update in April of 2023 and October 2023 to the Finance and Planning Committee. So I want to focus just a little bit on the efforts that we've had since the last board update, which was in October. So we had the November open house. That was our kind of major event that we had during that time period. We had about 30 attendees in Longmont and 100 attendees in Broomfield. The RTD study website comment form. This is basically people going onto the RTD website and signing up for distribution of email information and to provide comments. Is about a little less than 800 or so, 785 of those filled out in that time period. And then the self-guided online meeting, which is really mirrored exactly what was in the public in-person open houses. It ran for about a month. And so it really gave an opportunity to people that maybe didn't have time to fill out a form at those open events, or people that maybe couldn't make those open events to see the same content and be able to provide us with comments and information on the study. In that online meeting, we had about 6,000 views, and then 2,600 or so of what we call engaged sessions. So that means they actually got onto the online meeting. They actually clicked, searched through, did surveys, provided feedback, etc. So they actually took some action on the web page. And then we received about 390 or so total survey responses during that time period. So real quick, I'll just kind of run through kind of what we heard. I would say that a lot of what we heard is pretty similar to what we heard in the January, February feedback earlier in the year. This particular question was, what do you see the benefits of the peak rail service? They could pick 3 potential options. By far, the kind of largest one here is to reduce my carbon footprint, embrace a more environmental friendly lifestyle, The next biggest one, getting to the destination without worrying about snow, traffic delays, et cetera, kind of a reliability response. And then kind of from there, the added time to train to give, added time on the train gives them time to work, rest, do alternate things. And then kind of rounding out the next few kind of in the all about the same level are the cost saving on gas, insurance, safety, and relying on transit to run errands and access other opportunities. So the next question we asked is, what do you believe your greatest barrier to accessing the station? So really the biggest one was missing sidewalks and bike lanes. So we've heard a lot from the community up in the area that it's kind of this first and last mile connectivity is a pretty major concern. Next was the missing and infrequent bus service. And then kind of beyond that was the unsafe walking and biking conditions, followed finally at the end by the lack of secure parking. So it really is more about connectivity and movement than it is about parking as one of the general things that we've been hearing quite a bit about. How can peak service be enhanced to better meet your needs and expectations? So this is, again, very similar to what we found in January and February. The biggest one is the add weekend service. The next one that we heard for a lot of people is a reverse direction. So a lot of these comments really kind of came down to the sort of the definition really of what peak service is. We know it's limited. It's limited in its direction. It's limited in its time frame and its frequency. Just touch on those two. What concerns you most about peak rail service? And again, service only in one direction. So this is kind of getting to that reverse commute response. The limited hours of operation, again, limited service, limited runs, and the lack of weekend or evening service. Those were by far the three biggest ones that we heard from the community as we reached out to them. And then again, the next one that kind of follows up there is the connection, the first and last mile, the connection to other transit service and destinations. The next question is, what is the most important element to include at or adjacent to future stations? I'll be honest with you, we kind of asked this question for just as much guidance, I think, with our stakeholders as it is for us. So when they're looking at land use planning and what would fill in around a station and how they might plan their communities, this is important information. Commercial and retail space is to shop, eat, grab, etc. So it's really a commercial piece, followed in with housing within walking or biking distance. And then pretty level behind all that is a safe and secure places for commuters to park, secure places for commuters to store their bikes, and enhance bicycle and pedestrian connections to the station. So next steps as we move forward, we're going to continue to work on the identification of the required infrastructure. We're compiling inventory costs for track and siding improvements, systems, crossings, stations, and fleet. This all goes into the common set of facts. And then we're ensuring project reflects RTD's commitments and obligations to accessible transit. So this is really the piece where we get into the high-level boarding, high-level trains, and how we can provide the highest level accessibility and access to the rail system. We're looking to complete the common set of facts. The biggest piece of that's outstanding right now is the BNSF component. What are their costs for the corridor? But we want to make sure that we fully understand the feasibility of the peak service concept and what would be required to implement this particular service. We want to keep making sure that we continue to explore options and opportunities. We will continue, as Director Davidson talked about earlier, our commitment letter to the Front Range Passenger Rail District that he and Ms. Johnson signed are, I think, evidence of our commitment to continue to work forward and look for some opportunities. And then we will continue community and stakeholder engagement, identify periodic and stakeholder touch points. And really, our recommendation is that this continues really beyond the peak service portion here. So we think of the peak service it's going to give us this common set of facts that really build the foundation for what we need. And it allows us to go in with our eyes open for any kind of potential partnership if that happens to be the direction that we choose to go. And with that, that concludes the presentation, and we'll answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stanley, for the presentation. General Manager, CEO Johnson, and Ms. Vishwakarma, thank you for joining us here. At this time, I will open up for questions, comments from directors. I will start with Director Broom, please.
Thank you, Chair. What kind of information does the Dr. Cog model generate? And was that information available when FasTracks was put together?
Mr. Stanley?
Yes. Dr. Cog provides information on planning and growth in the region. Yeah, that information was available. It's different now. I mean, it's updated periodically. Right now, the latest Dr. Cog information that we have is actually pre-pandemic. It's 2019. And that's the only information that we actually have to base our ridership numbers on. But just because there is nothing else there right now, and we need a base accepted growth plan model that we can base our modeling on for our ridership.
Okay, and finally, is BNSF, have they estimated how long they're going to be in the coal business?
Good question. We don't know. The BNSF operations, they keep pretty tight to their chest on what it is. I would think if you would ask them that they would probably always keep that option open for whatever might potentially come down the pipe. That is, in general, what we found with the BNSF, is that they want as much flexibility as they possibly can have for operating in any manner that they see fit. And they're a private entity for profit, so it's hard to fault them for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Broom. Thank you, Mr. Stanley. First Vice Chair Catlin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have a few questions that don't require long answers.
Okay.
And then I have one comment. The first one, you talked about the high-level boarding recommended for the Northwest Peak Rail Service Plan, but that there's low-level boarding at Denver Union Station. What is anticipated to mitigate that?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. The low-level platforms at Union Station are tracks 4 and 5, which only serve Amtrak at the moment. So we would anticipate that we would probably utilize track 8, which is where the current B line comes in, and that is a high-level platform.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Very simple. You talked about track improvements and you cited curves and that sort of thing. And actually, just to disclose, BNSF was my client. I worked on designs for BNSF for a number of years during my career. So when we went down to BNSF in 2020, right before COVID, they talked about also some adjustments to the grades. And I know that the siding lengths were pretty significant. You talked about 7.2 miles. That's quite a bit of track. But I was just wondering if that was factored into some of your estimates as well.
So BNSF is actually preparing the cost estimate for all the infrastructure that's going to be required for track improvements. So they will estimate everything that's in their plans that they've identified. I don't recall in the 20% plan seeing any grade adjustments. It was mostly curve adjustments. Things that might change, as an example, a curve from maybe a 20-mile-per-hour curve to a 40-mile-per-hour curve. Okay. So what we've given the BNSF is a travel time goal, and they're basically doing their engineering to try to hit that goal.
Okay. Oh, and I think probably the grades had to do with grade separations. So the length of approach and approaches, that's really what made the difference in the grades. Okay. Ridership, yeah, I know we're using the DRCOG model. It seems to me that depending on any kind of collaboration or cooperation with Front Range passenger rail, that if we were to combine certain sections, that ridership would change if you were adding on riders from the northern communities. Are you looking at both sets of ridership numbers or just for the peak service feasibility study?
Do you want me to, I can jump in, it doesn't matter. Yeah, so right now we are looking at peak service. Our focus is for understanding what the common set of facts are for the peak service. What I would say is if we get to that point at some stage where we do have an agreement of some kind with Front Range Passenger Rail, and there might be a partnership there, then I believe that, yes, we would need to maybe take a look at that.
Okay. And
If I may just add additional information relative to the Front Range Passenger Rail Service side of things, recognizing that DRCOG serves as the Metropolitan Planning Organization and their 2050, vision plan and things of the like, that's where all the data sources come from relative to planning. And so I just wanted to ensure that I stated that going forward, because when you look at Front Range Passenger Rail, they incorporate an additional MPO as well. So holistically, as you talk about the numbers, there could be different projections, but for all intents and purposes, those same numbers are coming from DRCOG within the auspices of where we provide service relative to the regional transportation district boundaries.
I've done modeling in both MPOs, so yeah, I'm aware of where that comes across. And finally, just a statement. We are paying BNSF for their 30% design and for their cost estimating. Is that part of the $8 million that we allocated from the FISA account?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
We're still within budget.
Yes, ma'am.
Excellent. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, First Vice Chair Catlin. Director Busick, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got 5 questions. First, this is called the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study. So my assumption has always been that HDR is not going to tell us whether it's feasible or not. You guys aren't going to tell us. We're going to get all the facts, and then we're going to make a determination whether we think it's feasible or not feasible. Is that kind of how that's envisioned?
Mr. Chair, if I may, I would say that's absolutely correct. And one thing I do want to note, quite naturally, this feasibility study won't be complete until we get those numbers from BNSF, because we have yet to receive them as of late. We were anticipating having that information at the end of the calendar year 2023. We still have not received that information. So I wanted to daylight that for all of you, because I think that's, incredibly important to note, because we won't be able to ascertain the feasibility of it if we don't have those costs.
Right, and that leads me to my second question, which is about projected ridership, because in my mind, that's a huge component of feasibility. Because if the projected ridership numbers come out as, you're gonna get 1,000 people a day riding this thing, and it's costing us $1.5 billion, doesn't make sense, meaning not feasible. So am I correct in assuming that's a pretty important component of feasibility?
Mr. Chair?
Please.
Yes, Director Busick, that's critically important.
Thank you. And really, we're looking at what someone says is apples and fish, right? So we've got Northwest Rail from Denver Union Station to Longmont that has 10 stops. And we've got Front Range Passenger Rail from Denver Union Station to Longmont that has 3 stops, right? So really different animals, in a lot of ways, right?
Yes, that's correct. The services and the concept for each one are different for sure. And I think there's places where we converge, so to speak, on what we're looking for, and I think there's places where we diverge. In particular, I think the one that kind of comes to mind is really station stops. That is a astute of you to pick up on, because I think that is one of the big ones.
Yeah, I think so. So another Front Range Passenger Rail, do we know whether they are anticipating using these high-level cars? Because it wasn't that Amtrak car that you all went on a little choo-choo ride with, a low-level car? Sorry, I don't.
Mr. Chair, if I may?
Please go ahead.
I did not participate on that ride. I was actually with the FRA administrator in Washington,
Not there.
D.C.
You missed it.
Yes. But to the question in which you posed, recognizing we're talking about intercity passenger rail, talking about commuter rail, there could be efficiencies. However, there's yet to be a service development plan relative to FRPR. RTD is further ahead in our assessment. So we would just be conjecturing and speculating relative to what may be. Hence, Mr. Stanley did indicate some opportunities once we do have that information. But if we were to do it today, I would say that we would be looking at a cross-platform transfer somewhere along the alignment.
Yeah, that leads me to my next question, which is, we've got this overhead catenary system currently in place. My understanding from way back was we were told that you can't take that up to Longmont because we've got problems with bridges and things that it can't get under. So, and then that kind of means we might be using those DMUs, those diesel multiple units. Would we just get rid of all the OC, if this gets built, would we get rid of all the current OCS from Denver Union Station to Westminster and just run DMUs the whole length?
Mr. Stanley, please.
Yeah, you're correct in that we would not be operating the overhead catenary powered trains on the BNSF portion of the alignment. There are clearance issues with existing bridges that go over the current BNSF. So we're not necessarily trying to select a specific vehicle for the purposes of this study. But there are a lot of different options. There are, you could do a diesel electric multiple units, you could do diesel multiple units. But I don't believe, we haven't contemplated removing the OCS, because even one that's not OCS powered, unless you get a large double decker, which is not something that we're looking at, we should be able to clear underneath the OCS lines without any issue.
We just don't want that having to change trains somewhere.
Sure.
Jumping off one onto another.
Yeah, for us, we're looking at a one-seat ride from Longmont into DUS.
I'm so sorry, you used an acronym, OCS?
I'm sorry, overhead catenary system.
Thank you.
It's basically the overhead electrification that powers the trains.
And my last question is that we've got a rescue train. Can we use it on this alignment as well? I love that rescue train.
The tug.
Yeah, that's great. We need a new one for this one, or is it get around? Because I know that was a whole big thing, where we're going to store it, where we're going to keep it. And
We hadn't contemplated that necessarily. We can take a look.
I have
Thank
no
you.
more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Busick. Thank you for the answers, Mr. Stanley. Director Deschel, please.
Thank you. I wanted to just put a finer point on Director Catlin's question, which was, are we within budget? And my question is, are we on projected budget? I'm assuming if the costs are linear, we should be about 7/8 through, which means we should have a spend of 7 million. This last eighth could also be much more expensive than the first portion. How are we doing on target for the last segment that needs to be completed?
We're on track to be under budget for the target. Our biggest components to the contract are the HDR contract and the BNSF piece.
And do we have BNSF's design? I know we don't have their numbers, but have their design costs been billed normally such that we could track it on our budget?
Yes, we do.
And then our RTD costs, which are for the extra outreach, et cetera, are those picked up in the 8 million or in our SG&A?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. Sorry. Yes, we have staff included into the budget, and it is being charged against the budget.
And Director Guzman, I don't know what the G stands for, but the S is salary and the A is administration, and it's an accounting line item. And if anyone knows what the G is, General? Doug McLeod? General? Thank you. So presumably with each of the five milestones, there have been deliverables. Are those available for the board at each milestone completion? And if they're in this month's board packet, I apologize, I did not have the opportunity to review it in full prior to tonight.
I would say they're more phases the way they're doing it. It's not necessarily a specific deliverable for each one of them. So we have a lot of kind of individual reports. As an example, as you go through, there's a traffic analysis report, a transit analysis report, an environmental report, you know, and go on and on. I think there's about 20 something. So basically, towards the end, those will be kind of really compiled into the executive summary and summarized. There's not necessarily a deliverable specific to each one of those components.
Great. And I'm going to say this next question, recognizing that those in glass houses may not always want to throw stones, but BNSF has been in the news a lot lately with respect to derailments, including last night in New Mexico. When we're talking about design standards and rail, is that a universal design standard? Are we using their standards? Are we using our standards? How are we supposed to be squaring that, recognizing, you know, are we taking on additional liability because we've seen what some of that standard rail looks like? Can you help me understand that component?
So the standards that are being used are the BNSF standards. It is their track. Now, there is a difference between running freight rail and running passenger rail. There's different requirements associated with that. In general, you can say that freight track can slack a little more than passenger rail. So that's, you know, in order to operate that, they would have to maintain the track at the levels appropriate to run the passenger rail. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't know that we're necessarily putting ourselves at any more risk.
If I may, Mr. Chair?
Please.
And moreover, when Mr. Stanley made reference to positive train control, that's only required on passenger railways. And so to the point with Class 1s, that's why if RTD would go down this path, or if it's FRPR, that's why they would incur the cost of positive train control. And so that's an important factor to take into consideration as we go forward as well. And to Mr. Stanley's point, that Class 1 railroads that are carrying, you know, freight as opposed to people, this agency would incur greater insurance premiums and things of the like. It's something that I and members of the team have been advocating for as we have looked to the federal government in reference to having some relief relative to being able to get insurance. Because right now our only options are abroad because of the high potential of risk and exposure with railroad networks here in the United States, because they're really lacking in reference to intercity passenger rail. They are tracks that are being, you know, repurposed for all intents for freight.
Okay. So, and maybe the 30% design phase isn't the appropriate phase, but if I'm hearing it correctly, it's BNSF standards, which may be, well, which are necessarily different and possibly lower than the standard RTD would be held to if RTD were to go out and build passenger track. Or is the track the same and it's just the PTC that's different?
In general, what I would say is that even the BNSF standards and RTD standards actually have to comply with other regulations. AREMA, as an example, is really the big one that would provide guidance for how they would design and maintain their tracks. Same with us. We actually use AREMA as well. So I think hopefully that answers the question. That there is a larger guiding criteria beyond just the BNSF kind of picking their own criteria.
Yeah, got it. Because I know they benefit from deregulation as of late. And then are we being impacted from a timing perspective by the furloughs at BNSF? Is that hitting the staff that we're working with?
We have not heard anything from them on that. In fact, I would say that the people that we're involved with have been pretty consistent, and I don't see any drop off at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Duchel. Second Vice Chair Geisinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Patrick. That was very helpful, as some of your other public engagement has been. You mentioned that the modeling we have from DRCOG is pre-pandemic from 2019, and that we need a growth plan model for ridership. I'm assuming that that's one that looks at the growth in the region over the next, 30, 50 years, whatever. Do we have that? Is that coming? Is that not in the DRCOG 2050 plan? Or
Dr. Cog is working on an update, is my understanding. I don't remember exactly. We made a presentation to Dr. Cog probably about 6 months ago, and they said they were working on it. I don't remember exactly when they said they would have it, but it's not going to be within the duration of the peak service study.
So will we get ridership numbers?
We will have ridership numbers. Unfortunately, they're going to be, based on 2019 data, which is as current as we have.
Okay. And when do you expect we'll be having those?
Honestly, it's one of those things, I think, until I would say it's towards the end of the study. We want to make sure that we have one of the things we're very concerned about is we don't want to release information premature and have to walk it back and erode public trust. So we want to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row before we release any of that. So I would say it's going to be towards the end of the study.
Thank you. And what about travel time? Do we have those numbers yet, or are those coming later too?
That one I think we can tell you. So we had a consultant do some modeling for us. Hatch is the consultant, and they looked at basically the track configuration. I thought it was reasonable for us to hit about mid-60s, 65 minutes or so, plus or minus a little bit. So that's the number that we've provided to BNSF, is 65 minutes plus or minus 2 minutes. So that when they're doing their design, that's the kind of the basis for when they're looking at curve smoothing and curve adjustments and that sort of that nature.
That's Longmont to Union Station?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you have that split out? I'm not asking you to remember all of them tonight, but
We do have a document that we could split out for you if you're interested. We could provide that after.
and right now we're modeling 10 stations along that route?
Yeah, yes, it models all the existing stations and the new stations.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I would say on that number though, that is, again, that's a model. That's a study. So until we really dig into it, there could be some adjustments a little bit.
On the stations, is that what you mean?
No, on the time.
Okay,
So,
all right, thanks.
sure.
Thank you, Second Vice Chair Geisinger. Director Harwick, please.
Sorry, I got a boatload of questions too. So in no particular order, do we have a timeline on when we know when BNSF will tell us how much they're going to charge us to do this?
Yes, and Ms. Johnson touched on that earlier. Per our agreement, they're supposed to have that really to us at the end of May, early June.
Okay.
For the final. But as Ms. Johnson mentioned, we are, right now, we have not received the 20% ROM that they were supposed to, they're still working on that. So I guess stay tuned a little bit on that. We're still pushing them pretty hard to make sure that we get that number in that time frame.
Okay. Sorry, I missed that when you said that. So as we're proceeding, hypothetically, as we're proceeding with this, and let's say it's either with front range passenger rail or without, if we do all these enhancements, and I think I already know the answer, but if we do this, is BNSF gonna, as they're going to benefit from all of these enhancements, are they going to share any of this cost? Are we fitting the whole bill? Even though they'll benefit from it, in theory.
Sure. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is but not for us, the BNSF would probably not be doing any of these improvements. They can run their operations currently as they are. So it's difficult, I think, for us to say that we're not the cause of these improvements. They can always do slow orders and run their trains slower and a bunch of other things operationally that don't necessarily work for us. So all the impacts, so yes, they will get benefit out of it. But I think the answer that we get from BNSF is we don't have to do any of this stuff, so why would we pay for any of this? It's really you guys are the ones causing us to make these improvements.
I figured that was the case, but let's see here.
That doesn't mean we'll just kind of give up and not, push back on them, but that's, I think, the nature of the beast.
Sure. And so then I'll try to stay on this one. So then hypothetically, if we're doing 3 3 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, like, if we find that ridership is substantially higher than expected, how quickly can we scale up service if necessary?
That's an interesting question, and I think it really depends on the nature of the service that we're scaling up. So if it's reverse commute, as an example, and say maybe we're able to get a large enough time window in our peak period, we might have enough room in that time window to run, like, as an example, a return trip, potentially. There's an infrastructure component to that, and the fact that you're running two-way trains, and you might have to do some infrastructure improvements to make sure that you can pass. So it just depends on what it is. If it's additional frequency, it's additional trips on the track. And our agreement with BNSF depends on how flexible we can make it, is going to be one of the key components as well. So anytime we change that agreement, that operational agreement with BNSF, we are potentially having to enter in a new negotiation for what that new service level might be. And I would say that is a fairly lengthy process. And again, just depending on what it is, if we have to build infrastructure, that's obviously going to take longer than if it's maybe just a dispatching and maintenance type questions for BNSF. Hopefully that answers your questions okay. It really just kind of depends on what it is a little bit.
Okay, this is my last question, and may or may not be for you. So obviously, there's a few other lines that we've promised through FasTracks. This was probably answered before I was a board member, but why are we doing this one first, and why are we not looking at, like, the L line continuation or something else?
Director Harwick, I think I can address your question on that. At the time, there had been the concept of looking at the peak service feasibility or the peak service plan had been proposed before COVID, before my time on the board, as an alternative path, given the high expense of the Northwest Rail. The cost numbers and ridership numbers had been roughly estimated, but not really refreshed. So one input was deciding to take a look at that peak service feasibility, since that had been proposed in 2019, but not had the cost looked at. And then also right around the time that the board authorized this study, there was the predecessor of the Front Range Passenger Rail District, the Southwest Chief and Front Range Passenger Rail Commission, was looking at and contemplating intercity passenger rail across the Front Range. The conclusion of the board at the time was really the only realistic path forward as it relates to Northwest Rail is to look at what partnership opportunities might present themselves. We did have some discussion about the hypothetical possibility that the operational model of the contemplated peak service feasibility or peak service could align with what a broader project would look like. So it was, I believe, actually simultaneous at the same meeting, or at least in the same month, that we authorized the MOU, the cooperation agreement between CDOT, RTD, and the Southwest Chief and Front Range Passenger Rail. At the same time, then we authorized proceeding with this study, which was really to look at what are the costs, what is the feasibility of our most expensive outstanding FasTracks corridor, and then be in a position down the road, and I think we're approaching that point, to look at whether or not there is the potential for aligning with partners. Thank you, Director Harwick. I'm going to go in the order I saw the hands. Director Rusha, online, please.
Thank you, sir. So I have a piggyback on Director Harwick's question, and then I have a few other questions. So does this mean that, the other unfinished FasTracks projects like Southwest or the L line, I mean, has the board essentially just taken up, like, do we have a policy that says, we've put those aside until we have figured out the Northwest Rail question? And it's not meant to be a gotcha. I've just noticed that, it almost feels like those projects have just dropped off our radar, even though, I mean, theoretically in our FISA account, we you know, we could pay, you know, for at least one of them, without going into further debt. So, just if you could explain a little bit more, you know, have we kind of said, as it relates to these other projects, they're on pause until we have solved this question one way or another?
Thank you, Director Ruchet. No, that's not my understanding. We did have a policy, and I will need to look back at when this was passed, that was a commitment to the unfinished corridors. I believe it was around the time of the unfinished corridors report with Dr. Cog. The board certainly has not taken a policy to move away from those other unfinished corridors. I think practically speaking, for the reasons that we discussed, with this being one of the most expensive outstanding projects, with the proposal to look at the peak service plan in 2019, and then ultimately doing so when the Front Range Passenger Rail Commission was looking at the possibility of a broader plan. I think that did take up a lot of the resources and emphasis, but certainly no policy has prioritized or pulled away the commitment to the unfinished corridors.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I make a comment before my next question, I do think we've given the impression that that is our policy, because that is, I think, because that is our practice right now. And I hope that, you know, we can do some course correction on that framing. But I do have questions about this, about the study, if I may. So when FRPR talked about positive train control costs, they said something between 200 and 350 million. And I am assuming that was like, that also is because, you know, they're talking about going up all the way up to Fort Collins. Is that true? Or is that our estimate as well? Is there someone who can address what we think the PTC, you know, range would be if we were to move forward on commuter rail for the Northwest segment?
I see Mr. Stanley unmuted.
Yeah, I can address that to some extent here. I don't know exactly the basis of the number that Andy put out there, so I can't necessarily speak to that. And what I could say on our costs is that's still part of what we're still investigating. So we don't really have a set number on that just yet. That's actually part of the BNSF scope of work. They actually use a system. It's similar to CTC is what their system is, but the train control that would be on the corridor for our segment would be part of the BNSF scope of work to define what that cost is. And we don't have that number yet.
Okay, so, and I don't want to play gotcha, and if we don't have the number, we don't have the number, but like, when someone says, you know, 200 million to 300 million, and that was on a white paper that our name was on, that's a really wide range. And so, like, I mean, even if we had, you know, a range, it would be good to know. Maybe that's a follow-up question, because that number, just when I read it in that joint white paper, really jumped out at me. And then, as far as an agreement with BNSF, how, this is my ignorance showing here, how long do those agreements last, and how are they renegotiated? Like, does that make sense? Like, I would just think that BNSF would increase the cost, you know, over time, or how does that work? Like, how would we be able to build in that cost control in an agreement like that, or budget long term?
Mr. Stanley.
Yeah, I can answer that, I think. So, you know, we obviously the way we negotiate the deal would dictate that to some extent. I would say that some of the other examples that we've looked at, I think North Star in Minneapolis as an example, these are very long-term agreements typically, unless you modify it at some stage to add different service. And in fact, I think, you know, on some of them, I don't think there's really an end date. It's almost like an in perpetuity kind of contract. So that's what we would, obviously, I think if we were to move forward, that's what we would aim for is a long-term agreement. and that is not atypical. That's a typical scenario for the BNSF agreements.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That is good to know. And I know that we're not done yet. And I understand if you can't give me an answer. But like, do we even have a preliminary, even if it's a range, ballpark, based on what we know right now and where you are in your study of what this would cost us? Or is this something that we are not even going to say out loud until we have more final numbers? And I also just want to apologize in advance. I'm not trying to get anyone in trouble, but this far in, like, do we have a sense? Because previously, and just for context, previously, we did have estimates. We have done, you know what I mean. We've done a little bit of modeling, and I would just like to get a general sense of, even if it is a range, where we think, based on what we know, where we would end up.
I would say in general, we kind of have a rough idea, but there's a lot of moving parts right now.
Sure.
So I think it's not ready for, it would be premature, I think, for us to even issue a range at this point, because the BNSF is probably one of the major components of it. And without knowing what that number is from the BNSF, I would be very hesitant to actually put any kind of range out there right now, because that could be misconstrued by somebody, and at that point we would put another real number out at the end of the day, and now all of a sudden we got multiple numbers kind of floating out there.
If I may, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Stanley, for that. And I just want to reflect on the comment that Mr. Davison, or Chair Davison, excuse me, referenced, how we came to be with this project. I can remember specifically when I took this job and I was getting questions about this project, I asked the board, or recommended to the board, that we actually establish a common set of facts. So with that as a backdrop, we would be remiss to sit in this room and say what the costs are, because that was what was happening previously. And then in recognizing that nobody knows the cost or the conditions of the track, that is totally BNSF's operation, recognizing they are a for-profit entity, as Mr. Stanley referenced. We can negotiate, but for all intents and purposes, he could sit here and give a number that basically would be not very conducive for this effort as we go forward, recognizing we have not received not one single cost from BNSF. So I just wanted to state that for the record. No one's trying to be cagey, but we would be, I would say, negligent to put forward a number in which we had no facts in which that's predicated upon. Thank you.
General Manager and CEO. And then if I may just briefly, yeah, thank you. I think precision is the key here. This was one of the challenges with that unfinished quarter report, and our estimates at the point was a discussion region-wide about a potential lack of precision of ridership numbers and costs. So thank you for that. Director Ruscia, please, back to you for additional questions, comments.
Thank you, sir. And also thank you, GM Johnson, for that comment. I'm in agreement that, it would be irresponsible to talk to, to speak to cost if we have these major variables that are just unknown, and it might almost feel like a repeat of 2004, and so I completely understand, and I respect that. I respect that answer. And I don't think that you were trying to be cagey at all. So I do appreciate that. And I would just say, I don't want to get too off topic, but I would just say that, I really hope this board also engages or goes back to that unfinished quarters report. I think it was 2019. And even if it has to be on a smaller scale, that we take a look at those other unfinished FasTracks projects and what those might cost. Because I think that is also our responsibility as well, to the taxpayer. This one here, because of the nature of the project, is maybe a little bit more complex. So I completely understand that answer. And this one is, this next one is, maybe we can't answer it, but do we have this, even based on old numbers, like in a long-term financial plan still? I know in the past we said maybe we can bring this in the 2040s or something, but I am worried that we're setting an expectation, something is going to happen that ultimately we might not be able to pay for. And just, when we talk about our finances, short, medium, and long term, maybe I'm just too new here. I don't see where the money would come from, and so I guess I'm asking, like, we can't unlock a train to Boulder with this simple trick called the FISA, do we even have any like kind of preliminary modeling that suggests that we could cover, some of these costs, or is that just not, so are we not there yet? I guess is that question. And I didn't mean, I hope I didn't ask a leading question, and I'm not trying to ask a Goster question. But if there's anyone that could address that, I would appreciate. And then kind of in addition to that, maybe in the answer, like, is it reasonable to expect that if we were to move forward with this, with or without front range passenger rail, knowing what we know, will we have to take on extra debt, additional FasTracks debt?
Thank you, Director Ruscia. I think just a short answer is we're not quite there yet with this, but I do see General Manager and CEO Johnson is unmuted, and we'll yield the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair Davidson, and thank you, Director Ruscia, for the question. So recognizing where we are, for all intents and purposes, why the general populace is unpleased with RTD is because we stated that we couldn't fund this project until like 2045 or 2050. I've asked Mr. McLeod to address this more specifically relative to our current budget forecasting. Mr. McLeod?
Thank you, Doug McLeod, Chief Financial Officer. We do not have any of the capital costs or the operating costs forecasted in our plans of these additional unfinished corridors. The statement at the time that we stopped building was that until we have identified funding, we will not include any of those additional expansionary projects in our forecast. Currently, the most recent 30-year forecast was completed in 2019 with Dr. Cog, and we have not updated that since that time, with the exception of the Reimagine forecast, where there's certain assumptions made with population growth, et cetera. But I don't believe in that one there's any additional expansionary rail lines necessarily contemplated. It's more for expansion of overall system-wide service for population growth.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. Thank you, General Manager Johnson. Director Ruscia?
Thank you so much. And just one more question. We received an email in general, or excuse me, in our comments suggesting that, we could partner with FRPR and, kind of combine resources and get both of these studies done within the timeframe of Senate Bill 184. And I don't want to bring that conversation to this conversation, but it is related. And, not being familiar with how these studies go, I'm going to defer to staff on this one. And I was just wondering if there's anyone who could address that. Like, does that make sense? Like, is it really that simple that we could maybe do a change order, knock our heads together more than we already have, speed this up, and providing BNSF, provides costs and such, we could get this done within a, couple month time frame? Is that a reasonable expectation?
Thank you, Director Ruscia. I'll turn to General Manager and CEO Johnson with respect to the peak service.
Yes, if I heard the question correctly, you were referencing what was stated in the bill regarding the timeline to have a report about a path forward. Is that correct in what I heard?
Yes, ma'am. And we also did receive written public comment suggesting that, that to move forward with our study as is, the way it's scoped, is almost a waste of taxpayer dollars, because the expectation of what we're studying might change, and that it might, and it is actually feasible to change course and meet those expectations.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, thank you very much, Director Ruscia, for the clarification. I believe Mr. Stanley stated it very well, that the undertaking we have here is totally within the auspices of RTD determine the feasibility of the Northwest Rail Peak feasibility service. That's the intent. As it relates to the bill in and of itself, recognizing that we do have a scope that we put out for bid via public solicitation. This is what we're obligated to do relative to the commitment and the delegation that you all provided to me and I in turn provided to staff as we move forward with this feasibility study. In relationship to what's cited in the bill, I think if anything, the intent is to look at what might be most fruitful relative to capitalizing on operational efficiencies. Now, traditionally, sure, one could put out a solicitation calling for what needs to happen and have subject matter experts do that, and contingent upon the scope or the statement of work that's provided, that could be done in a 90-day time frame. If in fact you have already done the solicitation, you have proposers, and you've issued a notice to proceed. I do think that is very unlikely that that could come to fruition in such a short period of time. That is my experience as a professional being in this space for 32 years. I can't basically opine on what the drafters are thinking, but I have been clear and have shared that with the chair and members of the team, that while we're looking at what might be feasible, that's with all the other legwork being done, and a study could be done in 90 days, but you have to do the front end and the back end as well. Thanks.
And just as final comment, Mr. Chair, thank you, Ms. Johnson, for that. I asked the question because I did want to defer to staff, and when we do get comments like that, they're pretty serious, especially if there's an accusation that we're wasting taxpayer dollars, by moving forward as is. But I hear you, and I trust you, and I trust our team. And I also just want to say thank you for this presentation, and also, thank you, Patrick, for being so patient with all of our questions, some of which, we might have asked before. And I look forward to the next update. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Ruscia. Thank you for the thumbs up, Mr. Stanley. Director Rosenthal, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Speaking of timelines, I do see that it is 9:35, so I'll just make a couple comments, which are questions, and then you don't have to answer. Just keep them in mind as we go forward, and perhaps others will, because I know we have other things on the agenda. So one thing is, and maybe this does fit or does not fit, the presentation does talk about operational requirements. And so will we be able to attract and retain operators and maintenance facility staff and other staffing levels in order to operate this project, the peak service? Another observation / question is there was a statement about upgrading drainage. And so I guess that calls to mind the 16th Street Mall project. Is when you start to dig down, what else are you going to find? And is that going to add cost and time to this project? A long time ago, I used to work for Level 3 Communications, which laid fiber optic cable conduits along that route, which, as I notice on the map, now Level 3 doesn't exist anymore, but it's acquired by Lumen. And so now I'm just saying, like, that's along that BNSF route. And so I guess that is a major concern that I have. And then finally, is it also part of your study how this would impact the Flatiron Flyer, and would, in terms of ridership, would it take ridership away from the Flatiron Flyer at a time when there's an expectation we will increase service on the Flatiron Flyer? And so would we be creating this new service? Will we be elevating the Flatiron Flyer? So how do those impact each other? Thank you.
Thank you, Director Rosenthal, and thank you for the willingness to kind of table some of those questions. Just to summarize, to make sure I have that, you're asking about the staffing levels for operation as a consideration of potential unforeseen costs related to drainage, and a question around impact of ridership on other services, in this case, particularly the Flatiron Flyer. If it's okay with you, given that the first two are some considerations, I would open the floor just to Mr. Stanley, or if General Manager and CEO Johnson wants to comment on whether there's been any consideration of alternative routes and any impact.
I'll take that question because I see that being overarching as we're talking about people power and service delivery and things of the like. So recognizing that Mr. Stanley did talk about our existing B line, and we do have a concessionaire agreement, it's quite likely that we would be engaging in discussions with the Denver transit operators. We do have a 30-year concessionaire agreement with them, and we're in like year 5 or 6, I believe. And so as we talk about where we are collectively, that's something else that we'd have to go to the table to negotiate as we look for any other options relative to service delivery along the corridor that would expand the B line.
Thank you, General Manager and CEO. Director Rosenthal, does that cover? Great, thank you. Director Lewis.
Yeah, just quickly, train riders have to be subsidized. It's not a question of if, it's how much. So I'm curious, in your report, when you start getting your numbers, will you be giving us subsidizing numbers and compared to other projects that are similar size? I think you had mentioned Minnesota. So, we would need to know how much we'll be subsidizing each rider and compared to other cities of like size. So thank you.
Mr. Stanley.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't know that we've necessarily considered specifically breaking it down in that manner, but we can take a look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Stanley. Thank you, Director Lewis. Secretary Guzman, please.
I'll be quick. It's a comment. Thank you for all of the hard work. I would just like to point out for the public and for everybody in this room, we have mentioned in this one conversation, Dr. Cog, FRPR, RTD, all of the excellence in this room, all of the brilliance and the expertise that we have hired at this agency, with multiple questions coming from multiple directors in every aspect of this build that we have been following for so long. And we have done it without needing to be told to do so. Why? Because you have elected representatives sitting here thinking about the future of public transportation, and we are looking at this as a whole district, not parochially, not worried about what's happening in any of our sub-districts. We are working together. And so I wanted to get that on the record before we move on to the next item of business, because we don't need anybody's permission or direction to do our job as directors. That's why we're here. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Guzman. Not seeing any further comments or questions on this item, I too would just like to say thank you very much. Tremendous amount of expertise and work has gone into this. Very much appreciate this. And most of all, again, as I've said time and time again, I thank the entire team for the engagement with the community and working collaboratively and precisely with everybody throughout this. So with that, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for the questions and the discussion. We will move on with the agenda. I will entertain a motion. Everything that we have here is pretty essential that we complete. So given our recent 4-hour change bylaw, I would entertain a motion.
I move to extend the meeting for 90 minutes, just to try to keep a consistent, concise focus on the next segment.
A second? Do I hear a second?
A second.
All right, I hear a second. Any no votes on that? Director Busick, one no vote. Any other no votes? All right, the motion does pass with the movement as Director Deschel, second as Director Geisinger, for 90 minutes from now. We are going to move on. I see that some people have taken some breaks here from directors, so we're just going to keep moving here so we can get through the agenda. We will now move to the unanimous consent portion of the agenda. There is one unanimous consent item on the agenda listed as Section 17, Action A. This is for the General Manager and CEO Total Compensation Market Analysis and Annual 360 Performance Assessment Tool Contract Solicitation. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
I have Catlin as the movant, second as Bouquet. Do I have any discussion on this? All right, are there any, if we need to pull from the unanimous consent if we're going to discuss. Director Ruscia, please.
You know what, it's fine. In the interest of time, we can keep going.
thank you. Are there any no votes? All right, seeing none, the motion will pass with 15 aye votes, 0 no votes, and 0 abstentions. We'll now move to the recommended actions portion of the agenda. I do have a couple of comments here about this. We're going to make some adjustments. There are 7 recommended actions on the agenda. As you may have noticed when reviewing the board agenda, there are 2 items coming forward for our collective consideration that did not first go through a committee. Those items B, Senate Bill 24-184, amend position, and C, Downtown Rail Intersection Reconstruction Contract Award, were added to the agenda per Bylaws Article 5, Conduct of Business, Section 3, the regular board meeting agenda, B and C1. Chair's discretion and items from the general manager. Given the significant public interest in items D and E, and given the tremendous patience of staff here, which are the May 2024 Title VI Service Equity Analysis and the May 2024 Service Change Proposals, I am going to ask that those items be taken before any other recommended actions. Once through these items, we will return to what is now listed as item B, Senate Bill 24-184, amend position, and proceed accordingly. Is there any objection to this slight reordering of business this evening? All right, thank you. So with that, I appreciate the flexibility. We will move forward with item D from the agenda, which is the May 2024 Title VI Service Equity Analysis. This is for the Board of Directors to adopt a Title VI Service Equity Analysis report for the May 2024 service change to comply with federal laws, regulations, and guidelines related to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Do I hear a motion?
So moved.
Second, Sloan.
Busick as the movant, second as the Sloan.